right, well, welcome to Launching into Young Adulthood. So my name is Carolyn Romano. I've been a professor over at the School of Social Work for the last 10 years. I also have a private practice where I see adolescents, transitional age, sort of that 20 to 24-year-old sort of age range in families. So this is sort of an area that I live in, let's say, right? And you were saying you see some of the students here at BC, and I laughed because you have 201 with your own, right? Because I see all these teenagers and then all these kids who are 20 to 25, and I think like, oh, it's exhausting, right? But it's fun. It's fun. I think it can be fun. Let's talk about that a little bit. But let's think about sort of our conversation today, and I would like it to be a conversation because we're going to talk about this thing for a little bit. The adolescent brain. And I found this lovely image, and it just cracked me up so much I couldn't help it. So let's take a look at it for a second. One of the things I really loved was that our judgment gland, do you see how tiny it is? Way up at the beginning, at the top. That's okay. Come on in. And then, the self-image one is there. But what is so cracking me up is the other ones like, oh, balance and coordination levels. That's a little bit bigger. The ego's bigger, right? And we see all these things. But what's interesting is, right, this reality of the time between, let's say, 14 and 24, where there's all of this development happening in the adolescent brain, right? It's another one of those max growth times, just like 0 to 1 or 0 to 3. And in those time frames, what tends to happen is an immense amount of growth generation and then some cleaving off, right? And so we don't keep everything that we generate in those time frames, but what we're doing is setting ourselves up, right? And the misconception that there's no ability to function when you're in your teenage years, as some of them tell me, well, Carolyn, my prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, so how could I possibly do that? Yeah, it's not fully developed. It doesn't mean it's not developed at all. So let's talk about that too, right? And here's sort of the reality. Our brain, right, really goes, and we'll talk a little bit about this after we talk about sort of the stages of family growth, right? But it sort of develops from the back to the front. Right? And so the problem with our brain going from the back to the front in development is that this is sort of our most basic functions, and this is the most complex functions, right? And so we'll talk a lot about that today as we think about, okay, how do we help folks who are in this age bracket to sort of develop into really amazing young adults, right? That's sort of our charge for the day. But what's interesting is, the adolescent brain stuff, all of this neurobiology stuff that we're learning is fantastic, but it's telling us things we didn't know before, right? We didn't know that the brain continues to develop the prefrontal cortex, this guy up here who's in charge of our higher level functions, including decision making, until 24 or 25 years old. That's relatively new information, right? And so thinking about how do we stimulate that in an effective way, helpful to know, right? But the ability to do that has to have a little bit of background information. Hi, welcome. So let's talk a little bit about what we call the family life cycle stage. Now, this is McGoldrick, and they are some theorists who work in the family therapy world of things. Okay, so that's where this comes from. But let's look for a little bit, because every family and then every individual in a family has all of these factors acting on them all of the time. Right? And at the bottom, we've got sort of horizontal stressors, which is sort of development, right? When you're like an itty-bitty and we're holding you in your arms versus a toddler sort of exploring the world and then learning to run and sort of moving forward in life, right? We have different developmental crises that we have to sort of endure. Puberty be one of them, right? Sort of figuring out how to engage with people who are your own age as opposed to just your family, right, when we get into adolescence. And then we have sort of the unpredictable ones, a disease, for instance, or sort of an unexpected injury or death. I know that I've had several teenagers who've come to me in the middle of all of this development and sort of chaos time, and then, hormones, which we haven't talked about yet, is like in a sport and then unfortunately gets a head injury, right? And so isn't able to sort of have the capacity in their brain because it's healing on top of the fact that it's supposed to be generating, that's sort of complicating things. Does that make sense? Okay. And then we've got sort of vertical stressors. And vertical stressors, and I don't mean this to be mean, we're just talking about factors, really. They use the word stressors. But we've got all these things like family patterns, myths, secrets, and legacies. So these are our traditions, like the expectations I have an adolescent I work with, and he says to me all the time, like, I just needed a mental health day. But the rule in his family is, you go to school unless you're dying, right? And so that came into huge conflict with him and his parents, right? Led to some poor choices, which maybe we'll talk about next or a little bit later. But what's interesting is he then tells these stories about how his dad, when he went to law school, said his most famous moment was how he did a paper before the semester started. Think about how that myth has shaped this child who's now 17 going on 18 and a senior in high school, and his expectations for how hard he's supposed to work in high school, right? I'm not saying it's good or bad, it just is. And all of these things influence. Are you supposed to be home on Friday night? Are you supposed to be home on Sunday night? How does that conflict with a sport, with friends, with life? Does that make sense? So thinking about these, right, they impact everybody, the whole like sort of social, cultural sort of environment we're in, but then the community, workmates, friends, right, extended family, nuclear family, and then the individual, right? And we all are having moments during this trajectory of development, right? It's not just our kids, it's all of us. And that's sort of the hard part. So what I wanted to do is just do a brief introduction to what the stages are and then really focus on the two that we really want to sort of look at. But first is we have to think about what is our goal, right? And the goal is not independence, it's interdependent self. So let's talk about what that means for a couple of reasons. Because I think in our role, or our world as Americans, right, in the United States, like being independent is this huge, amazing like goal we all have, but it's not really what we're seeking, right? What we're seeking is to have some interdependence. And that's that ability to be able to stay connected and also go out into the world, right? And so there's some chief things we want to do. We want to make sure that people can practice self-control, which we'll talk about is difficult because the limbic system and the adolescent sort of world is making emotions really big, right? Even for small stimulus. I'm sure you've all seen that at some point. We've got sort of empathy, being able to read emotions in other people, which is important because if you can't do that, how can you empathize, right? And then thinking about caring for others, being cared for by other people. And that's one of those pieces where I always crack up when working with teenagers because like, I can do everything myself. Good, and can you? Right? So there's all these pieces that we have to think about, right? But seeing sort of and accepting differences in others, but being able in that to maintain your own belief and values, right? So to hear from others, but also able to sort of maintain. And then, you know, really be able to sort of be generous with your thoughts, emotions, and even sort of ways that you look at other people, even when, right, maybe they don't match up with you, right? And so that charity or sort of caring of heart, right? And then this last one, which is really thinking about sort of future generations, right? And being able to do that. Now, that's one of those things where we try to leave things like, you know, a little bit better for the people we love, right, than we had for ourselves. And I think that's a universal. But this is really what we're doing. And I think what's really interesting is we have this draw at independence for like adolescents where their like goal is to figure out, who am I in the world, in relationship to my family, in relationship to my friends, and the world around me? And it's like this whole existential potential crisis waiting to happen, right? You're laughing because you know, right? Yeah. But it's really interesting because there is this like grand ideas. I mean, I love teenagers because they're so idealistic. There was the, you know, walk out of schools nationwide and across the world last Friday for like climate change. And I feel like that was amazing. And I love the idealism, right? I hope it inspires some in me sometimes because I get into this like, well, okay, but we can just move the bar a little bit here. And right, that's like what happens as we get older, right? We sort of figure out grays and not the black and white so much. But, you know, if we're seeking for this interdependent self, right, it's really coming against that ideal of American values where we say independence. I'm going to do everything on my own, right, which is not real, right? So as we look at the stages, right, I've got the two we're going to talk about more in depth in black sort of bold, right? But it really starts with, in the family life cycle, because just like developmental levels of children, families have them. And they sort of match where the growth of children go. And young adulthood, right, is really the stage sort of where people are out there actively dating and seeking like mates so that they can form their own families, right? And so what we're going to talk about is just before that. And college and sort of launching from high school. But this is really where a lot of things happen, because when they sort of make the commitment to be a new family or a couple, right, in a committed way, lots of things have to happen, right? New family has to be accepted by the families of origin or the extended family. I have a colleague who said something hilarious to me the other day, and it was such a good statement that it really stuck with me. Her daughter's getting married next weekend, and she said, it's really interesting. She's always going to be my immediate family, but I'm now her extended family. That's weird. And I was like, yes, and true, right? Because now her daughter's starting to make decisions with her new husband, or to-be, right? And saying to mom, like, hey, is this okay? Or, I'm thinking about this, what do you think? And sometimes saying, oh, you're right, I'll go this way. Or, nah, thanks for the advice, but I'm going to still go this way, right? And she says, it's really uncomfortable to be the one having to change. And I said, yeah, both of you, right? Because it's not always comfortable for the individual either, right? So as people sort of come and join families, now this life cycle stage, I have to say, is really sort of binary and is really sort of assuming people are going to have children, right? So just know those are caveats as we talk through this. And then the next stage is when children, or our children, form new families and then have their own children, right? And what's interesting around this is the first time I feel like all of the boundaries are sort of like, emotional sort of connections with people that haven't sort of grown get shown up, right? The tensions start to build, right? When people start to have their own kids and different parents of, grandparents now start to tell them what to do or what they should do, or sometimes take over and do what they wanted to do, right? And then you come home from work and you're like, right? So we have these moments where tensions build, right? And what's good about tension, honestly, is it gives the opportunity for growth, right? It doesn't always feel that way, right? And as we think about sort of all the renegotiation that has to happen, what's your role as a grandparent? What's your role as a parent, right? What's your role as a spouse? What's your role as a partner, right? And how do all those things get redefined? What's interesting is a lot of families never talk about any of this, right? We just slide into the next stage. And that's totally fine for a lot of people. And it only becomes a problem when it becomes a problem, right? And we don't necessarily notice. When I find it comes the most often, the biggest problem is when we hit adolescence, right? And so we're going to talk about that in a second. And then this next sort of stage of launching, sort of getting them into college, off to college, into their first job, right, sort of scenario. And then what happens with the rest of the family. And then families in later life, right, which we're not going to focus on so much today. But let's think about all the changes that have to happen. So as a segue, right, when we have younger children, our focus is on the younger children, right? Focus on each other as a couple, hopefully gets maintained, but often gets diverted because we have to take care of the things that cannot take care of themselves, right? And as they start to grow, right, we sort of see lovely like moments of independence or interdependence, right? And as they are sort of exerting all of this, we're hopefully getting them through the preteen years, which can, be tons of fun, and into adolescence, which can be more fun, right? So let's think about sort of what this means. These are the goals, right at this stage that are up here. So what does permeable boundaries mean? It's interesting. I teach family therapy in the School of Social Work, and I always joke about, like, we live in a fabulous place, New England, right? We have all of these beautiful rock walls that are, like, yay big, right? Which definitely show boundaries, but you could, like, walk over them should you want to, right? And you can definitely communicate over them versus really tall ones, right, that sort of block sort of the view. Or, those rambling fields with no boundaries at all, right? we want rock walls in our relationships, right? We want the short ones that we can jump over, right? And we can certainly talk. And that's what we mean by permeable. It means that things can flow both ways, but there's definitely a definitive, like, what the boundary is, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But it's interesting because this is what sort of happens with the permeable boundaries, is that kids, now adolescents, right, start to want, I think just biologically, more independence, right? It's a time where things like licenses come up, or going out with friends and going to parties might be sort of a topic, right? And as we think about sort of what's the sort of need developmentally, right, for that person who's going to start to go through that who am I in the world sort of experience, and with all we know what's going on with the development of the brain from the back to the front, right, we've got a lot of challenges on our hands. And what we need to do, though, is allow for the space for that growth in a way with structure. And we're going to talk about that today. That's sort of where we're going to end. But, you know, the focus is on peer relationships. And what always cracks me up about peer relationships is it's where the changing of information happens, right? Like, kids grow up in our houses, and they know our traditions, and they know what we're doing and what they're expected to do in our household. And then they meet a peer, and they become friends, and they start talking to one another. And what starts to happen is, well, wait a minute, your family doesn't do that? How come your family does it this way? This also happens, again, when we get into that sort of making of a new family, right? Because traditions tend to be different, right? And thinking about sort of all of those things. Wait, what do you mean? What do you mean you're allowed to go out if your homework's not done? What do you mean you don't have to do chores? What do you mean you've got the used car and it's like an LR2? How does that work, right? And there's all these then comparisons, right, with, wait, you've got better than me. Huh. And then it's, so-and-so's parents said, right? And we get into this place of sort of this, you know, focusing on it and then trying to figure out, okay, well, what does this mean, right? And what's okay and what's not okay in our family, right? And what's not okay because of where you are and your skills and sort of how you're able to manage things with, like, what's going on up here, right? But what's nice about this time is it does leave room for, you know, people to refocus on their partners, maybe their career if that's what they want to know, because they are more able to do things for themselves, right? And thinking about sort of, it also allows us to refocus on younger people or sort of our parents if they're getting into the place where they need management. And this is where that whole, like, sandwich generation sort of terminology comes from, as this stage as well as the next one. But, you know, it's interesting. When we start off with teens, and I'm going to need like 14-ish, right, to 24 is what I'm talking about, we really have to start to say, what is it like to be a teenager, just a little bit, with your hormones going like this, and your brain working from the back to the front, which means we're going to be more reactive than thoughtful, right? And how do we sort of think about what the expectations are? Because this is not a time in life where I'm going to tell you there are no expectations. That's ridiculous, right? But it is a place where we need to start to teach a little bit more of how they make good decisions, right? So let's think about this. I joke with teenagers that I work with a lot of the times that one of the difference between you sort of being a younger adolescent and you being an older adolescent is you following through with what you say you're going to do more of the time. Like, when you're 14, I probably expect you to do it, like, let's call it 75% of the time. And if it's more than that, I am stoked, right? But by the time we're 16 and have the ability to drive a car by 16 and a half, right, we're hoping it's more like 80, right, 85, right? And I would argue adults were around 95, but at 5%, usually we're good at telling people beforehand that we're not going to meet whatever we couldn't meet, right? Because it's not like we're perfect and we can meet everything, right? And, you know, it's interesting is that as we move through these things, this is the next stage we're working towards. And what's interesting, and the reason I even bring this up, because we're really focused on that last one, is because our job is going to be to help them have the skills to be successful in the next stage, right? As people who care about teenagers, that's our sort of charge, right? But families at midlife, and really when students are sort of, and this is like sort of end of college, leaving college, so that like 22, 24 sort of end of the range, we want to see like, okay, well, we're going to have some change going on. Family's going to grow and subtract in some ways, right? My immediate family, or their extended family coming up. But it also allows for different things, right? Development of adult-to-adult relationships, right? Which can be really satisfying. But what's hard there is we have to be able to see the teenager as somebody who's capable of meeting us sort of on a level play field-ish, because we're still always going to be like their older, right, parent or whatnot, or older sibling, or older whatever. But it allows us to have like really good in-depth conversations, right? And those can start when they're 16, 15, 14, but they get even more enriching, right? And as we think about the realignment, right, all of that changing stuff has to sort of come to a place, again, back to the lovely rock walls, right? That's the hope, is we want clear, permeable boundaries with everybody, right? And thinking about sort of how do we work with those things that become difficulties, like disabilities or sort of needs, right? Or checking in on older folks if that needs to happen. And thinking about how do we check in on, like, those kids who are living in apartments and like don't really know how they're paying their rent because their job doesn't pay them enough. I always used to laugh. My older sister would come home and go shopping through my mom's cabinets when she was in college. And I was like, what are you doing? She's like, grocery store. I was like, that's Mom's cabinet? Like, that's our food? What are you doing, right? She's several years older than me. She's like, you'll understand one day, right? And I was like, okay, fine, right? But thinking about sort of all of these sort of goals as where we're headed is only useful when we think about what do we do now, right? So I'm going to talk just a couple of seconds about this, right? So I've broadly talked about back to front, but let's talk about sort of what this is, right? Because the amygdala is the first thing to really join. And amygdala is like this guy back here, right? And this is where our stress response is housed, right? So our fight or flight, it's why we become sort of overwhelmed, right, at times. And when we sort of think about, oh, the joys of adolescence, and when you tell them something that's really important, like, I don't know, no, you can't, what's the response that you get? Why can't I? I think that's civilized, actually. Why can't I? Good, the argumenting and debating. So we'll talk about that. What other responses do we get? Slamming doors, right? Tears. You just don't care about my social life, right? We see sort of the gamut, right? And what we have to realize is that their emotional response is not just the fault of this back thing here, but also their limbic system is excreting hormones at a ridiculous rate, right? Puberty is happening, all of those other fun changes. And those two centers have more of the control than this prefrontal cortex, which is, unfortunately, responsible for decision-making, emotional control, and it really is about like all of our executive functioning too, which is like how we organize ourselves, right, and how we sort of do it. I always laugh when teenagers say to me, and this is a direct quote from multiple, I am so much more calm when my room is clean, I just can't though. You just can't clean your room? I try, and then it just like doesn't happen, or it gets dirty again. I'm like, yeah, you gotta like do it once a week and like pick up after yourself. It's like resetting. What? You mean I have to reset? Yeah, right? So thinking about sort of these things, oh, that's just so much, Carolyn, why are you telling me this? Sorry, right? And thinking about this piece of, right, also getting them to start see where it is that maybe those parents of theirs are not crazy, right? Maybe they've got a decent point. And there's a balancing act there, right? But here's what's important. When we start to remember that this is it, I love that the love lobe is so big in this picture. By the way, it's not for y'all. It's for the people they're interested in, right? Which can only like lead to bigger emotions when something doesn't work. What's that? Not love for mom, no. Unfortunately, love for mom is probably way back there for memories, for chores and homework, which is way at the back end. Oh, yeah, the yin and yang, thank you. I was like, I knew it was there somewhere. Right, the yin and yang, right? The good and the bad. But thinking about sort of how that love center then informs those emotional responses too. Like the number of teenage girls and boys I have picked up off the floor metaphorically from my office because he said, she said, no. I once had to do something about prom in January, and I really thought the kid was like exaggerating. And no joke, kids were all asking each other to prom for May and January. And I was like, oh my God, that's a lot of pressure. Because then from now to January till May, you've got to like date this person that you like maybe randomly asked to prom. That's not full of any emotions at all, right? So what do we do about this? I think that's the bigger question here, right? We have to know a few things. One, it's changing, but we have influence. And that's what we want to do is think about how do we have our influence. Because we know the amygdala first, and then this happens last. It's not non-existent, it just fully fortifies last, right? So when we think about sort of that they have to drive the experiment and figuring out sort of what is a good risk and what is a bad risk. And I think that's one of our jobs is to help them think through that, right, in a way, because what we're doing is actually stimulating the prefrontal cortex in a way that builds those systems we want strong and reinforced by the time they're 24, right? Multitasking is so not a thing. What happens when we multitask is actually that our brain switches from one thing to the other rapidly, and neither thing, or multiple, maybe there's 3 or 4 things, gets our attention fully at all. Now, some of us have a better aptitude of switching between, right, all of those things. But I would argue adolescents are terrible at it for lots of reasons. One is their brain is not fully formed. 2 is their emotional center is so big, right? And what happens when you're multitasking and looking at your phone, because it's right here, and reading a history paper? And nothing that happens on this thing is not emotionally charged. Have you noticed that? What is that about, right? So thinking about, no, they help me study. No, they don't, right? But getting them to understand that is hard. Sleep is important. Your brain at this age, like this, again, 14 to 24, is doing this rapid growth process. And then sort of it has to naturally, every night we go to bed and it synthesizes. It cleaves off things we don't need, and it strengthens and reinforces the things that we do need. The more we stimulate a pathway, the stronger it gets. The weaker it gets, the more likely it gets cleaved off. And the reason I say that is because when we're trying to think about strategies for helping, right, these folks, we want to think about how do we get them to walk down the neural pathways more and more. And I think one of the things that we tend to do is help them by giving them the answer, and we're not then giving them the benefit of walking down the neural pathway, right? And this, separation is supposed to happen, but it's supposed to happen with connection, right? In an ideal world, that really means that we have moved from this position of like them telling us everything to them wanting to tell us things, right? And sometimes asking like, well, what do you think about this? I mean, how amazing is it when your kid comes home and says, I have this thing and I have to decide between this and this, and I don't know what to do, right? It's a beautiful opportunity. Because what it's illustrating is, actually, they want you involved in their life. The problem is most of them want you to make the decision for them, right? Well, but I don't know what to do. Just tell me. Just tell me what to do. Well, we could do that, right? Or we can help them figure out what makes sense for them. And that's what I'm going to argue we need to do. So this is a parenting continuum that I always talk about with parents, with kids, with students, right? But we have to think about this parenting to protect on one side and parenting to prepare on the other, right? And I have a continuum, and the arrows are going both ways because depending on a situation, we might be on either end. However, developmentally, we tend to start on the planning to sort of protect, right? When we have a tiny baby, they cannot do lots of things for themselves, right? We are their protection, right? And even with small children, we're telling them what to do. We're setting up their play dates. We're taking them to experiences, right? We're telling them, no, thank you, put that down. That's too dangerous for you, right? But we also sort of, try to give them experiences that help them grow too. Some of them are hardwired, which is amazing that we are this complicatedly beautiful. When you have a small baby and it cries, what do? You pick it up, right? You pick it up and then you do this. Oh, it's okay, right? There's like this bigger eye thing we do. It's why those Beanie Boos, do you guys know Beanie Boos? Creepy, right? Totally creepy. But they're actually really smart on the toy maker's part, because big eyes and big emotions with little people stimulate the neural pathways that they need at that time of development. I know, crazy, right? Somebody did some psychology research, but they are totally creepy to adults, right? So I'll give you that. But thinking about sort of these hardwired things, right? I think what ends up happening is a lot of us don't have as many when we get teenagers because they start talking back. Why can't I do it, right? But I said, that's sort of benevolent. Like, that's nice, actually, right? Yeah, oh, you didn't add in the tone? And tone is a thing, right? Teenagers are acutely good at it, right? But thinking about prepare to protect, we have to think about sort of what is our goal, right? And our goal is to help them be successful at the next stage of development. And I know I'm being like a little bit academic here in some ways, but I think that's the piece is like, we need to think just what do we want them to be able to do? Like, if they're in college or later adolescence in high school, do we want them to be doing, like, I don't know, laundry? Do we want them to be able to make a decision, right, that benefits them, not in the moment, but benefits them generally speaking? I would say yes, right? And so we slide on this continuum depending on sort of the scenario. That makes sense? So I always talk about that. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about Vygotsky. And he's an old educational theorist, right? He's Russian. He's been around forever. But I think he leads us to a really good way to think about how to best help sort of this age bracket, because he talks about scaffolding, which we're going to talk a lot about in just a second, and this idea of zone of proximal development, right? And so thinking about sort of this zone, the center is what can they do independently, right? What do you know they can do hands down, right? No problem. Right? Like they can probably get themselves through the bathroom right in the morning, haha, maybe not in a quick fashion, but they know how to do it. And then we've got sort of the outside circle, which is like they can't even do it if they're guided, because it's out of their realm. I think about balancing a checkbook as an example, right? It's something that I don't believe any of us love doing, right? But teenagers, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, even who are decent with money, have no ability to really know how to do that. When do they get taught it? Like never, right? But what can they do if guided? And that's that CDP, or that zone of proximal development, and that's where I want to argue we need to be most of the time with our teens and young adults, is figuring out what can they do if I give them some support successfully. And then the question is, what kind of support do they need, right? Because all of this is really just about what's the distance between what they can do, right, and what they can't do yet. Because as we bridge that with the scaffolding, their center becomes bigger and bigger, right? And one of the pieces that we're actually looking to do is to turn whatever we're doing into something they can start to do for themselves, right? I just liked this quote a lot, so I put up the role of teachers, and I would say parents, because it says and others, in supporting learners' development and providing support structures to get to the next stage, right? That's our goal. I mean, love, care, and commitment as well, right, and all those other things that go along with this. But what's interesting is our job then is to provide the scaffolding, right? And so let's think about scaffolding for a minute. It's sort of an odd word to be using in sort of helping humans, because we think about it so much in the construction world. We've got plenty of that on campus at the moment, right? So as we see all the scaffolds go up, right, one thing that's really important that we may not be aware of is they pull it down by level as they're done. And the last level comes down last, right? And so that's what we're really thinking about as sort of the support we put around teenagers, is thinking about what do they need based on where we want to go and where they are, how much support do they need, and then as they start to be able to do things, we start to pull away level after level, right? And it doesn't have to be like laid out in a specific way, but what's cracking me up is like we just have to teach teens, I believe, how to effectively problem solve. That's a personal belief, right? But let's think about like how do we even do this, right? We have to, right, know what their knowledge base is. What can they do, right? And this is going to really fluctuate on what the topic is, right? Like if it's, you know, can you wash your own clothes? Because that's a hard skill that if they get into the dorms and they don't know how to do, what's going to happen? They're going to have no clean clothes for an entire semester until they come home for Thanksgiving and then wash them all when they get home. Or maybe you'll wash them when they come home, right? So thinking about sort of this skill, there's hard skills, and then there's these more soft skills like decision making or sort of figuring out what good or bad challenges are or opportunities and thinking through those. Does that make sense? So when we think about this sort of what's their current level, right, of knowledge, it has to be specific to whatever it is, right? What's the topic? And then what's the level of knowledge needed for the next stage, right? If they have to be able to choose classes in college, right, like what they need to take next, do they know how to do that? Do they know what pieces of data need to be looked at in order to make sure they make a choice that's in the structure of like the major they've chosen, right? Do they know how to figure out what to do on Friday night when they live in a dorm? Or do they choose to come home every weekend because they're close enough and they can? None of these are bad, right? Just different opportunities. And thinking about sort of what do we realize, right? And I put up here skill versus performance. And this is a really interesting dichotomy we have to think about when we're teaching things or when people are sort of learning skills is because can we teach somebody, right, to tie their shoe if they don't know how? Yes, right? But you wouldn't just give them a pair of shoes with leather laces and say, go, would you? No. We don't like teach people, right, the end goal. We teach them the starting goal. And then what we have often is, can we transfer the knowledge to the next thing? One of the things I find is teenagers are really good at focusing sort of their decision-making skills around classes, around school, around like just to-dos. Again, for school, somehow chores don't make the list of to-dos. But then they have to make a decision about what they want to do on Friday night or Saturday night, and they're paralyzed, some of them. And it's not paralyzed because they don't want to do anything. It's paralyzed because do I go to this party or with this group of friends, or do I do this one? And if I choose this one because I think I'd have more fun, then I'm going to feel left out because I didn't go with this one. Social media is beautiful, isn't it? Boy. So thinking about skills versus performance, I really do believe we have to decide, like, do they know how to do this, or have they done it in another place? And can we just transfer the knowledge, or do they not know how to do it, right? And this goes with a host of things. Like, I used to laugh. My aunt is actually a Catholic nun, and she lived in a convent since the time she was 18 years old. And we were driving from Washington, D.C., where I went to college, to Ohio for the holidays. And we stopped to get gas, and she looked at me like panicked. It was her car, by the way, not my car. She's like, I don't know how to pump gas. And I said, I'm sorry, what? And I was like maybe 20 at the time. She goes, I don't know how to pump gas. I've never pumped my own gas. She lives in an area where there's a place down the road where the guy pumps it for you. She has lived in New Jersey where, you know, they always pump your own gas, or at least did when she lived there. She never had to do it before. And I was like, okay, do you want to learn? And she was like, sure. And I think my aunt was like in her 50s at the time, so I think it was probably not her most favorite moment in the world with me. But I was like, come on, it's not that hard. Let's go. I'll show you how to do it, right? But it never occurred to me that my aunt didn't know how to pump gas. And I think that's how we look at teenagers sometimes. How do you not know how to do X? Well, no one ever told me how to do whatever it is, right? And so thinking about sort of what is it really, right, and sort of figuring it out. And then our next step is to encourage discussion, like asking open-ended questions. And I know this sounds really interesting and like, oh, we of course do this. But I think so often it's easier and time efficient for us to just tell them what to do, right? I think I even fall into the trap with some of my clients. I'm like, oh God, why didn't you just X, right? But it's not really helpful. Because what I'm trying to do is make sure that they've got A, the neural support in their prefrontal cortex to make better decisions next time. And if I don't fire sort of those neurons, I'm not aiding it. Doesn't mean it won't happen by itself, right? But I'm not aiding it. But also, how does it work when you tell a teenager what they should do instead? Cindy?
Well, I think one of the interesting things I just had this discussion with my son is that he made a decision about something and I wasn't really included in his decision making. And I had to try not to question the decision that he made. It was more that I wanted to understand how he came about the decision, but I had to be careful not to make it seem like why did you decide that? But it was more the like, oh, so what went into the thinking around that decision kind of thing. And that takes an extra effort on your part to not, because he took the responsibilities, he weighed his pros and cons, he did all of the things, but like, it was like, oh, really? You already made that decision? Why did you decide that? Like, you have to be careful how you ask, because otherwise you are making a judgment without realizing that you are.
True, and we feel left out, right? I mean, there's also our egos in there too, like, why didn't you ask me, right? So I think that's fair, and to your point, I didn't do the tone or whatever you said earlier. One of the things I talk with everyone about is this idea of communication and our packaging, because our packaging is like most of what people read first. My favorite example of this is the phrase, I'm fine. What does I'm fine mean? Well, I think it totally depends on the packaging. I'm fine. I'm fine. Right? It's completely the packaging. But yes, generally speaking, from a teenager's point of view, leave me alone, I won't talk about it, right? So, there are these coded things too with phrases. But thinking about sort of how we ask is really important. And so, when I say, like, do they have the skill or not, like, hey, if you had this thing to do, how would you go about doing that? I'm just curious. Could you tell me? Right? Be curious. A curious standpoint gets you more information often, right? And so when we think about asking open-ended questions, we want to ask questions to make them think about the next thing they have to do, right? So, okay, that means we have to be a little bit on our toes and not half asleep, which is often when they ask us questions, right? But thinking about sort of, okay, so you said you were thinking about this and your pros and cons list is this. Had you considered this too? Like, you don't drive, and how are you going to get there? Because that seems to be one of the bigger sticking points with the like 16-ish-year-old subset, right? They've got sort of the autonomy and sort of they're like making decent decisions, but they can't get themselves anywhere, right? And so thinking about sort of these outside the things. And then offer ideas, not advice. Right? Again, like my teenage guy I was telling you about, like he thinks his parents are lovely. He's got a great relationship with them, and he doesn't want to hear anything they have to say. Because all he's going to feel from them is I should be perfect, because my dad did papers before school even started, and I don't want to do that. So no suggestion from dad around how to do your homework, right? Doesn't have that message from that myth or that belief from the family. And unfortunately, it's not in that drawing, but their memory for things you've said over the course of their lifetime is impeccable. It's like the elephant that never forgets. But you said once when I was 7, right? And then, we want to sort of encourage them to talk it out loud. Like, Cindy, great that you said to him, like, help me understand. Like, what we want them to do, not because we want to be included, although that helps. It's because it's, again, firing that neural pathway in the prefrontal cortex that we want, because decision-making is housed here, executive functioning is housed here, regulation is housed here, right? And so if we can get that sort of going more and more, it's really helpful. It's interesting, too. I feel like often we are really effective problem solvers. And our children know that. And then what happens, right, is they come in and all they want is like the metaphoric or physical hug thing, right? So how many times does this happen? And I could be wrong, right? But like they come home and they're like, I had a terrible day and this, blah, blah, blah. And you start with, well, did you try? And what happens? Right? It gets worse. The emotion gets bigger, right? I just wanted you to tell me it was going to be okay, right? And so thinking about sort of teens and teaching them a little bit about like, maybe asking or telling me what you need from me might be helpful. Are we looking for like a hug here? with my words or physically, or are we looking for help with problem solving? Now, if they're overly emotional, is that a good time to problem solve? Okay, good. If they're exhausted, is that a good time to problem solve? If you're exhausted, is that a good time to problem solve? Okay, good, right? None of us thinks very well. But what we want to do about it is like, try to find these times where it's just enough assistance. And I find one of the more successful ways to do this is not hit a problem when a problem exists, although they usually are brought up that way, right? But have these like conversations with them when, like you're having like a decent time. How do you make decisions about, what to do on Friday? How do you make decisions about your schedule, right? And just getting a little bit of data. I think the other thing we do a terrible job of, just broadly speaking in our society, is we assume good behavior. What do I mean by that? I mean, often what teenagers feel and then report to their therapist, right, is that they did X, Y, and Z really well, but the only thing they got talked about was the one thing they didn't do well, right? And I think for lots of reasons, especially like maintaining that small, like, limbic system piece, saying, I really noticed you worked hard on this, this, and this, right? Maybe we could do sort of like, how could we get better at this other thing, right? And try to think about how do we grow that other end. Does that make sense? So, thinking about sort of all of this, I know it's a lot, right? Protect, prepare, we've got that continuum. We've got to figure out sort of, is it a skill deficit or a performance deficit? But then once we have those pieces down and then knowing what they actually know, right, then we can figure out what the next step is, right? And sometimes it's really just thinking about, like, how do you make a decision? I mean, how did you learn how to make decisions? Yeah, right? No one taught you. We just sort of figured it out. Maybe somebody had a nice conversation here or there, but nobody actually taught you. Wouldn't it have been nice if somebody had actually said, hey, when you have a problem, how do you figure it out? And then guided you through thinking through pros and cons? Like, kudos to your son, I suppose, Cindy, that he did pros and cons, right? Some teenagers won't even do that. They make an emotional decision. And that's the other issue. Our impulsivity at this age is just, off the charts, right? So thinking about sort of all of these pieces and how you put it together, right, is A, going to be individual to you as a human, right, in the relationship that you have with your kid or kids, right? And then the ongoing one you want to have. And I guess that's sort of the reason that I think about sort of this being my, like, place where I like to be talking to people about it is if we want to have really healthy, great relationships ongoing through life, no matter what happens or when we become the extended family, we have to do the work so it gets maintained, right? The other side of things, though, if we continue to give our kids answers and do things for them, right, are they ever going to move out of your house? Amen, right? No. And maybe moving out right after college isn't the goal, and that's okay. But do you want them to eventually do that, right? And what does that look like? Does that make sense?